Have you ever heard of a national parks passport? My wife and I each have one of these, and we love them. We are planning out our next getaway that's COVID-safe camping, so we pulled out this passport to look at some interesting and beautiful places in our country we can visit. See, these passports are run by the National Park Service, and anywhere that's in the National Park Service, you can go and get a stamp there. There are a lot of famous national parks like Yosemite and Yellowstone that you can get a stamp at, and there's also many other places. Like in our state of Wisconsin, you can go up to the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore and get a stamp there. And there's lots of other scenic and historically significant places throughout our country that are run by the National Park Service that are offering stamps as well. Alyssa and I got a lot of stamps last summer when we went and visited my parents in the San Francisco Bay Area, because as you can see in this picture, there are a number of places run by the National Park Service within a short drive of where my parents live. Some of these places are famous you've probably heard of, like Muir Woods. And there are other places that, having grown up in the San Francisco Bay Area, I knew about, like, for instance, John Muir's home. When I was in elementary school, I went on a field trip to John Muir's house. John Muir is a famous naturalist that worked with Teddy Roosevelt to help found the national parks system. And I also knew about Eugene O'Neill's home because a number of my classmates in high school went on a field trip to his house. Eugene O'Neill is a famous playwright that won the Nobel Prize in Literature. Both these homes are about 30 minutes away from where I grew up. But there was another spot in this passport book that was even closer to where I grew up, and I had never heard of it before. It's the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial. You see, I had friends that lived over by it, and so I'd driven on Port Chicago Highway a bunch of times, but I had no idea what Port Chicago meant. It seemed like kind of a funny name, and I never stopped and thought about it until I saw the name Port Chicago in this passport book. You see, there is a large naval weapons station near where I grew up, and this was the main spot that weapons were loaded to go out into the Pacific during World War II. On July 17, 1944, something went terribly wrong. The explosives detonated while being loaded onto a ship, and in the process, 320 were killed and another 390 were wounded. This was the largest domestic loss of life during World War II. Despite this being in almost my backyard, I had never learned about this in school. I certainly had never been taught that almost every casualty that day was black. The United States Navy asked Congress for $5,000 for each victim's family, a number that was reduced to $3,000 by Congress once they had learned that almost all of the casualties were black. The survivors at Port Chicago refused to continue loading ships out of concern for their own safety. They had lost faith in their largely white supervisors who had given them no training whatsoever on how to safely load munitions onto a ship, and who had valued who had valued efficiency and speed over the safety of these men in the Navy. And so these men, though, were not treated as if they were striking for their own safety. They were treated as mutineers. And as a result, 50 of these men were convicted of mutiny and sentenced to 15 years of prison and hard labor. This disaster, though, and the resulting court case began to shift public opinion, and as a result, the Navy desegregated in 1946, and this event at Port Chicago, just a few minutes from my house, was a key factor. Despite this really significant event happening in American history, I had never learned about it. Why was that? One of the many troubling things that's swirling in the water in this challenging time to be alive right now are conversations about race and racial justice and racial injustice in our country, because our nation has a long and troubled history on race. And sadly, much of this has not been resolved, as we can tell by the pain in our country right now. And this brings me to our second book in our summer reading series, Stamped: Racism, Anti-Racism, and You, by Jason Reynolds and Ibram Kendi. I know that talking about race continues to be a divisive issue in our country, and in light of all that's happening lately in our country, I felt that it was important for us to look at this book. But I have to admit that I felt fairly uneasy about doing so. I was unsure how this would translate to a sermon, but I was shocked that right when I opened this book, from the very beginning, it felt like the sermon began to write itself. I was struck by reading Stamped. We cannot talk about the history of race and racism in our country without also talking about Christianity. Let me say that again. We cannot talk about the history of race and racism in our country without also talking about our Christian faith. Chapter 1 of this book is titled "The Story of the World's First Racist." It's about this Portuguese historian named Gomes Eanes de Zurara, who justified the Portuguese enslaving Africans as missionary work, as means to bring Africans to Christ. Reynolds writes, Zurara made King Henry of Portugal out to be some sort of kind of youth minister, canvassing the street, doing community work, when what Prince Henry really was more of a gangster. And just over 200 years later, the first slaves arrived in the United States. They had been taken from Africa in present-day Angola on a Portuguese slave ship called the San Juan Batista, a ship named for St. John the Baptist. The man who baptized Jesus was the namesake of the boat that took the first African slaves to the United States. And then the Puritans in the United States saw the slaves that were coming over as a new mission field, and they began to celebrate the transatlantic slave trade as a way of bringing Africans to Christ. When I hear all this, I can't help but wonder, would John the Baptist wanted his name attached to such a terrible thing? Or would Jesus want this to be the way for people to be brought to Christ? Friends, whether we like it or not, when we talk about race in our country, from the very beginning, the church has been a part of the problem. But also, from the very beginning, the church has been a part of the solution too. The early Christian advocates of slavery ran into problems when they read in the Bible that God said, "Let us make humankind in our image." And again, God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. On April 12th, 1860, Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis declared the inequality of white and black races was stamped from the beginning. But Jefferson Davis got it wrong. He clearly hadn't read his Bible close enough, because all humans were stamped from the beginning, not with inequality, but with the image of God. From the very beginning, all humans are stamped with infinite worth and unconditional love from God, our Creator. From the very beginning of racism, Christians have been saying, wait a second. Humans are stamped not with inequality, but with the image of God. That means we are all equally valuable and equally loved in God's eyes. One of the most famous and consequential sermons in American history was not even preached in America. It was actually preached on the way to America. John Winthrop, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, gathered his fellow pilgrims aboard the ship Arbella, who was heading to present-day Massachusetts, and delivered a sermon titled The Model of Christian Charity. In this sermon, he lays out his dream for the American project, a dream that in many ways has come to be actualized, a community not only marked by love of God, but love of neighbor too, and also of justice and of mercy for those around us. As Winthrop began to wrap up his sermon, he quoted Jesus' sermon on the Mount, telling his church community aboard the ship Arbella, "You are a city on a hill." He's quoting Matthew 5:14. "You are the light of the world. A city on top of a hill cannot be hidden." Winthrop was telling his people, whether you like it or not, the eyes of the world are on you, and they will always be on you. And these words could not have been truer. Throughout American history, the eyes of the world have been on us to watch how we will lead and how we will act. The first time I left the United States was in I left the United States and left North America and went to Europe, was in January 2009. I went to Hungary, a country in Central Europe, to study math. One of the first nights I was there, I vividly remember going on my computer and seeing headline after headline after headline about a story coming out of Oakland, California, just a few minutes from where I grew up. There was footage on someone's phone of a police officer fatally shooting Oscar Grant, a man who was handcuffed and lying face down in the back. This was back in 2009. This was the first such video I can recall seeing. And I saw it on the opposite side of the world, and I was horrified. Something sunk in my stomach. Something broke inside of me. I could tell that something horribly wrong had just happened. And I also couldn't help but notice that halfway around the world, people were watching what had happened in my hometown, in my own area of being raised. With horror, people all around the world were watching Oakland, California. Friends, we are a city on a hill that cannot be hidden. And about 2 years later, I was studying in South Africa, and I was actually with a friend, and we were talking to a local pastor. And this local pastor had heard that my friend was from Chicago, and he leaned back in his chair and got a twinkle in his eye, and he said, Chicago. I've heard of Chicago. I hear that your city is one of the most segregated cities in your country. I went home, looked on my computer that night, and yes, sure enough, Chicago is one of the most racially segregated cities in the United States. But guess what was number one on the list? Milwaukee, Wisconsin. A seed got planted in me that day that I felt like Milwaukee, Wisconsin was going to be a part of my life at some point. It also reminded me of a few years earlier in Hungary that people around the world are watching us, that we are a city on a hill that cannot be hidden. And I want to wrap up now with one more story about us being a city on a hill. A few weeks ago Thursday, I was at Atonement having just finished recording worship for Sunday. And just before I began to pack up and leave, I heard our doorbell ring. I was the only person at church at this point, so I went to answer to see who was outside. I wasn't expecting anyone. There was a middle-aged black man I had never seen before outside, standing and waiting for someone to talk to. He began to explain to me that he had just dropped off his son in Green Bay and was driving back to Chicago, and he needed help. And in his words, I need help, and I didn't know where else to go. Despite the church not always being on the right side of the history on matters of race and racism, the church is still a place where people of all races who do not know where else to go turn. As the church, we too are a city on a hill that cannot be hidden. We're being watched how we handle matters of race. We're being watched on how we handle matters of COVID. We're also being watched by people who are desperate and who do not know where else to turn. When people look at our church, they see a place they can go when there is nowhere else to go. They see a place where they can be safe, where they can find help. They find a community where the love of God dwells. We're a community that's blessed with God's call to remind each and every person that we are stamped in the image of God, that we are all of infinite worth to God. What a precious, special, sacred mission God has entrusted us with. Friends, we are a city on a hill. We are the light of the world. We are the beacon of God's love and God's hope.